All right, welcome everyone. Whether you're in Israel, it's good evening, right? Good afternoon, and on the East Coast, good morning on the West Coast, and just welcome wherever you are in the world. This is a great pleasure. I'm Dr. Yoav. I head the Center for U.S. Studies at Tel Aviv University, and thank you for joining us. Thanks to our partners in this event, Dr. Nir Avron and Professor Yael Sternel from the American Studies and English program at Tel Aviv University. And of course, thank you to our guest, who I will introduce in a few minutes. But tonight, we would like to talk about a topic I think that has interested and confused and frustrated and even angered a lot of Israelis and also a lot of Americans, I think, since the Gaza war began nearly 3 months ago. And it's the criticism, the reaction, maybe even, the hostility, I think, voiced by some members of the LGBTQ community in the United States towards Israel. And this is obviously something you couldn't miss seeing, right? If you're just looking at the demonstrations and the campus unrest and the sit-ins in Grand Central Station and across a lot of American cities. So I think something that was very powerful and to a lot of Israelis very painful to watch was specifically the criticism and the hostility demonstrated by members of the LGBTQ community. So I think we organized this event really to try to understand that and to really do two main things. And one is to map out, really to try to understand who exactly is protesting and making that criticism towards Israel, because it's not everyone, it's not necessarily even most members of the community, and that's a very important distinction that we need to understand who we're talking about and talking with. The second thing that we want to try to establish here, I think, are the reasons, the justifications, the arguments, whether historical or theoretical or moral or philosophical, which were made first of all, in support of the Palestinian cause, right, which in and of itself is a legitimate thing to do, of course, but also the very passionate, some would call it fanatical criticism and kind of animosity harbored toward Israel. So that's kind of the two things we want to try to understand tonight here in this kind of webinar. So just before I present our speakers, and just a couple of quick caveats, right? One is we want to be careful about generalizing, and we're not generalizing here. One of the purposes of this kind of webinar is to try to understand who we're talking about when we're talking about the LGBTQ community in the United States, and especially those more hostile or critical of Israel, right? Because obviously it's not all of them, and so we need to be careful about generalizing. The second thing is that we're primarily focused here on scholarship, right? This isn't kind of activism per se. This is more of scholarship. Both Lillian and Corinne, of course, are very renowned, well-established scholars, and so that's our orientation tonight. We are, of course, obviously a research institute at a public university, so that is what guides us. And the final thing, and that really I think is the elephant in the room in a way, it's this question of, in a way, it's a catch-22. One of our students asked me if we're going to have people speak who are very critical of Israel and members of BDS, essentially, right? And of course, that is the irony here, because we are having this conversation to understand why some members of the LGBTQ community in the US do not want to engage in this conversation with us, right? So kind of we're having this talk because some members don't want to talk to us, and that's why we're having the talk to begin with. So I want to qualify that because we would love to have them in this conversation, but by virtue of the fact that they do not want to engage in a conversation with an Israeli university, so they cannot be represented kind of in this. And I wanted to throw that in there because I think it is important to know. All right, so just one technical thing. If there's a siren, we still have sirens once in a while. Unfortunately, here I'm in Tel Aviv, so the event just will pause for a few minutes. Right, I will go to the bunker. Then after a few minutes, once the siren kind of recedes, then I'll come back, right? So no need to go anywhere. If you're outside of Israel, then just get a cup of water or a cup of coffee or something, and then the event will continue within a few minutes. And if you have questions, you can just you have the Q&A option if you're on the Zoom. If you're on the YouTube, then you can just email. You can go to our Facebook page, the Center for the Study of the United States. It's how, and then message us or email us, and then I'll see those questions and I'll ask. Right. So we'll leave time at about right. This is going to run about an hour 15 minutes, and I'll leave about 15-20 minutes at the end for audience questions. Okay. So I got my spiel out of the way, and now I could finally. It's my great pleasure to introduce our panelist tonight. Right. For Professor Lillian Faderman. Lillian is an American historian, a professor of English Emeritus at California State University-Fresno. She has been labeled as, quote, the mother of gay and lesbian history for her groundbreaking research and prolific scholarship on lesbian and gay culture, literature, and history. I went to the bookshelves in one of our libraries a few days ago to read up on Lillian's scholarship, and basically the whole shelf of kind of the history of the gay and lesbian movement in the U.S. were books of Lillian, right? So that just tells you how central she was to actually founding the historiography in this field. And it's really a remarkable feat, I think. The New York Times has named 3 of her books on its notable books of the year list. And among her many, more than a dozen books she's published, I'll just mention some of my favorites. Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, A History of Lesbian Life in 20th Century America, The Gay Revolution, the story of the struggle, which is kind of a sweeping narrative, probably one of the best historical narratives of the entire gay rights movement in America. Woman, the American History of an Idea, and of course her wonderful biography of Harvey Milk, His Lives and Death. All right, so thank you, Lillian, for joining us. And our second panelist is Professor Corinne Blackmer. Corinne is a professor of English and director of Judaic Studies at Southern Connecticut State University. She is the author, most recently, of Queering Anti-Zionism, Academic Freedom, LGBTQ Intellectuals, and Israel-Palestine Campus Activism, which explores the appeal of anti-Israel ideologies to young LGBTQ persons. Right, we're going to talk a lot about this book soon. In addition, she edited, together with Andrew Pessin, and authored a chapter in Poisoning the Wells, Anti-Semitism in Contemporary America. She's written articles on everything from Jewish women's graphic novels to the Hebrew Bible. She's currently working on a memoir of her maternal grandmother, my grandmother as an abortionist before Roe. She lives in New Haven with her wife, and much earlier in her life served as an assistant medic in the Yom Kippur War, which is a different story that I really want to hear about later on. Okay. So let's begin. Lillian and Corinne, thank you for joining us. I want to start with stereotypes. There was a very famous, very popular Israeli sketch comedy show, Eretz Nehederet, and they ran a sketch 2 months ago that went viral, and it mocked kind of the young university LGBTQ protesters in the U.S., right? And we can't show the clip here just because of the copyright, but you have it on the chat. For those who are not familiar with it, you could see it. And it's very funny, but it also represents, I think, the frustration of a lot of Israelis of how they perceive the LGBTQ community, especially on campuses, the students, and how they perceive the hostility towards Israel, right? And again, it's just, they are, if you're not familiar with it, they are portrayed kind of as, as clueless, ignorant, anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, and also oblivious, kind of, and this is the thing, oblivious to the fact that, of course, in some of the Palestinian territories, certainly in Gaza, certainly in some Arab countries, homosexuality is obviously criminalized. Capital punishment in some of these places, it's a death warrant, right? You can get executed for sexual orientation. So my question, I want to begin with this, and both Lillian and Corinne, you've seen this clip. What does it get right, if anything, about the protesters against Israel? And more importantly, maybe what does it get wrong about this? And maybe Lillian, maybe you'd like to begin?
It's a satire, and as a satire, of course, it's exaggerated. For those of you in the audience who haven't seen it, 2 young students at a university, it's called something like Columbia Yosemite.
Right.
Yeah. And the young man begins by talking about how he's very sympathetic to Hamas because it's trending now. That is, he's clueless and he gets all of his information from the web. And it's certainly not true of all of the young LGBTQ people who are participating in these anti-Zionist protests. But for a large segment, it's not so far off. A recent survey that was commissioned by a UC Berkeley professor asked questions of 250 young people, a sampling across the country. What does from the river to the sea mean? 86% said that they were sympathetic to the idea of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, but only half of them could identify what the river was and what the sea was. And so many of them said the Euphrates and the Dead Sea. So they really don't know much about Israel. Another question that was asked was who was Yasser Arafat? Only about 50% got it right. Some, about 10% chose Prime Minister of Israel. So there's certainly a lot of ignorance among young people who are demonstrating against Israel now. But I think it opens the doors to real anti-Semitism. So at Columbia, in the last couple of weeks, there's a group called Lion Les, and the group is for, as it says, queer women, non-binary people, led by students of color. Recently, they sponsored a Black lesbian film festival, and the flyer said very clearly, no Zionists allowed.
Oh, right, I saw that.
This is a free Palestine space. But the anti-Semitism that was behind it was very clear too through the emails that the head of Lion Les put out at Columbia University, talking about Israel as an oppressor, and but not just that, also talking about how Jews have always been oppressors of brown people, and using language such as "fuck Israel."
Mm.
Please, Corinne. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to just follow up on what Lillian has said. Yes, it was obviously a satire, a sort of a broad satire. And it was mocking the simplicity and the lack of knowledge of these two young people. And obviously in this video, they were confronted by a Hamas fighter, and they were not able to hear what he was actually saying, including, I want you dead, or if you came to Gaza, you would be dead. And they would reply to that like, oh, so nice, I hope your children are okay, or some equally foolish nonsense. And so I think what the video was trying to suggest is that there's a lack of communication. They don't really know what Hamas would do. In fact, they seem to regard Hamas as akin to somebody's grumpy Trumpian uncle who comes to the dinner table and who is unpleasant, but nothing really to worry about. They don't take Hamas's, genocidal intentions seriously. And I can tell you for a fact, I'm in a town, New Haven, where Yale is. The students I know at Yale who are involved in the pro-Palestinian movement, many of them are extremely anti-Semitic and also justify that anti-Semitism by saying Israel is an oppressive nation, and also don't believe they tore down all sorts of posters, kidnapped, posters, and their excuse or their rationale was that these were not real. So gives you an idea of how everything that's emanating from Israel is seen as propaganda, but everything is emanating from the Palestinian side is seen as truth. So there's very, very little critical thinking going on. And that part of this, of the satire that was on YouTube was spot on. There's very little accurate knowledge, and there's a lot of belief in propaganda. So, there you have it. Where does that preceding stereotyping and propagandistic views of Israel come from? And we might take up Lillian Faderman talking a little about the history of this, and I will pick it up from like 1989, 1990 with the development of intersectionality theory.
So I think just before we come to that, I want to ask about the clip. What does it get wrong? Because it does get wrong in the sense that, and here's something again that I think is very dangerous for people who obviously, I'm not saying we're advocating for Israel, but people who are troubled by this kind of hostility, of course. Then it's this question of a. Right, you mentioned a lack of critical thinking, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I think we need to establish at the beginning of the conversation is how do they justify this, right? And one of the things that you write in your new book, or I think it's from last year, right? So it's recent, is this claim of pinkwashing, which seems so central to this conversation, pinkwashing. And homo-nationalism. So I was hoping maybe you can just establish those two terms, and then we could begin historically to trace how they developed it.
That's a very good starting point. Pinkwashing started in the United States with a writer by the name of Sarah Schulman. And she wrote, and Jasper Puar, who's another critic of Israel, pretty severe critic of Israel. And Sarah Schulman wrote this piece for the New York Times on pinkwashing. And her claim that she made was that two claims she made. One was that Israel was using PR firms to burnish its national image around LGBTQ people as a way of sidelining the Palestinian issue and making the claim that Palestinians were more homophobic than they really were. The second part of her argument was that there was a lot of Islamophobia directed toward immigrants from Muslim countries, and that was a terrible thing, that they really weren't like that, and it was just a lot of misdirected hatred. I want to mention something very interesting about Sarah Schulman's argument. And that is that she completely erases the experiences of LGBTQ Muslims. They're not on board at all, and that she completely erases their experience. So that's one interesting aspect of her argument. The other thing I'd like to say, in like a rejoinder to her argument, is there's no nation or no place that I know that does not engage in PR for their where they're coming from. New Haven has a whole office of tourism here, and we're not trying to. You could claim that we're sort of brownwashing or blackwashing poor Black neighborhoods in New Haven, and that would be ludicrous because everyone engages in PR. So pinkwashing. That's what pinkwashing is, the claim that Israel sidelines the Palestinian issue by burnishing its image around its very good record around LGBTQ rights, which is a very good record. Homo-nationalism is a term developed by a woman named Jasper Puar, and it claims that the only thing that the West cares about in terms of human rights is the rights of gay people. And gay people who sort of go along with the state that they're in, who are very nationalistic, who want rights to marriage and rights to serve in the military and so on, buy into this and hate Muslims. So both of these arguments depend upon this idea that gay people who want liberal advances in their society, ergo, hate Muslims. Do some gay people dislike or fear Muslims because they're homophobic? Yes. Are they more inclined to do that than the rest of the population? I would seriously doubt it, although I don't have statistics.
All right, so really, I think these two terms, right? It's just important to historicize them and remember also that they emerge in the early 2000s, right? So we have, first of all, 9/11 is a very important moment because, right, and I think my colleague in Taos Law School, Eyal Gross, he's written a lot about this, right? But he also made this claim that this also served this attempt to distinguish between kind of civilized and right and savage or something right after the war on terror begins. And that in that sense, then it was kind of this idea of saying that, oh, look, you know, the Arab countries, the Muslim countries are also homophobic, that served the war on terror, right? And that was, I think, a critical aspect of kind of why, you know, why a lot of Israelis also and Americans were troubled by the use of this kind of this perception of homo nationalism. But if we historicize it, and here I want to return to Lillian, when you look at the broader trajectory of the LGBTQ movement, you know, what you call the gay revolution in your historical narrative, can you trace this even earlier? Because, right, Corinne mentioned intersectionality, and that's an important term. But maybe even before that, when I think about the 60s, I think about the post-Stonewall generation, I think about the Gay Liberation Front and their ideas that it's a common struggle, right, for not just for gays or lesbians, but also for people of color, right, for Native Americans, and that it's everyone's in a way, right? It's one front, and it has to be one front. So how do you historicize maybe this development of intersectionality?
There have always been two branches, as it were, of the gay movement. One, a radical revolutionary branch, and one, a branch that I would call mainstreaming. The radical revolutionary branch began with Harry Hay, who founded the first homophile organization in the United States. Hay wanted to separate homosexuals, as the term was in those days, from straight people by saying we are an oppressed cultural minority. And his sympathies were with other oppressed cultural minorities as well. The mainstreaming branch has been concerned with getting rights for gay people, such as marriage and the military, and they've been less concerned with making coalitions with other minorities. I think that young people in particular, who are the ones who were so active in the anti-Zionist movement now, were very influenced by the Stonewall generation and the Gay Liberation Front. The Gay Liberation Front was not so much concerned about gay rights as throwing out the whole pie, not a piece of, they didn't want a piece of the pie, they wanted to throw out the whole pie because they said the whole pie was rotten. They had to make coalitions with all other minorities who were oppressed. And I think that those two branches of the gay rights movement, or now the LGBTQ movement, have always been in conflict with each other. The branch that we will call mainstreaming wanted the right to marriage. They wanted the right to serve in the military. We've gotten those rights in the United States, and of course, that's not what the other branch wanted. The other branch wanted a revolution. And I think it's the revolutionary branch that appeals so much to young people that is now so anti-Israel and anti-Zionist.
Corinne, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to follow up on what Lillian just said and comment that from my perspective, a theoretical perspective, this began with intersectionality, which is this idea developed by Kimberly Crenshaw that oppressions were intersected and so you had a blackness and femaleness, but if you had a Black woman, you had two oppressions. And this developed into this social theory where Jews were the only people who were oppressors and were not included in the minority. So you had this simplistic binary opposition between oppressed and oppressors. And to go back also to what Lillian was saying, you do have these two branches in the gay civil rights movement. And it is my observation that the radical part of the gay movement is less interested in not only gay rights, but also women's rights than they are in anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-Westernism. Those things come first. So if you would look at somebody like Sarah Schulman or Jasper Puar or Judith Butler, they would throw gays and lesbians under the bus, which they have done repeatedly, in the name of anti-Westernism and anti-imperialism. So those things come first. So, and I think that's always been a pecking order, as Lillian suggested in her commentary, that it's part of a, gays and lesbians are only part of a larger movement toward a social revolution. And now with gay and lesbian activism has changed a great deal. Now it's very much about transgender. And so as gays and lesbians have become more and more accepted in American society, Lillian, I don't know your last statistics that I have from the Pew Research Center, which has a very, very, very large sample, of something like 78% of Americans think that gay marriage is legit. And I don't think 78% of Americans agree on anything. So gay marriage is definitely in the bag. And that means that gays and lesbians have become mainstream. It's okay to be a gay or lesbian. So what this has done is that, young people like to be on the cutting edge. And what that has meant is that the adoption of transgender identity, the proliferation of that is something that is more marginal, and also the adaptation of this sort of radical stance that is less accepted by the rest of American society.
So that leads me, I think, to the question of then how right? Because we're talking about this duality, which is certainly true in the gay and lesbian rights movement in the late 20th century. But I think, as a historian of the left, we have that in the African American, civil rights struggle in the 60s, that division that emerges by the mid 60s with the Panthers, right? And Stokely Carmichael and so forth. And we have that in the women's rights, right? Kind of also a break between kind of Betty Friedan and National Organization of Women, and then more radical. And that's something very organic, I think, and natural to social movements. But then the question then is, today, how representative is this group, which is associated with younger student activists, but also a lot of the intellectuals that Corinne mentioned? How representative are they of the larger LGBTQ kind of movement in the United States, especially when it comes to their attitudes toward Israel?
They've gotten huge media attention,
Right,
because they have certainly demonstrated in great numbers, tens of thousands of them often. I think that the demonstrations are sort of a follow-up of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And for 3 years after the horrendous murder of George Floyd, there were massive demonstrations, primarily of young people, in this case against the police and against racism. It happened during the height of COVID, and many people weren't in school and they weren't working, and so they were available to demonstrate. And I think that there's the same kind of energy behind these anti-Israel demonstrations, with a similar population of very often LGBTQ young people. They're representative, certainly, of a large segment of the LGBTQ community, but particularly the young community. And I think there's a much quieter segment of the LGBT community who are pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, much more sympathetic to what's happening now why Israel needs to fight back than many of the young people are. There have been interesting polls, Harvard-Harris polls and Pew polls about opinions about Zionism and about the war. Something like 64% of those surveyed between the ages of 18 and 24 are very clearly opposed to Israel. Think, as one poll asked, are Jews oppressors? I think 67% of that demographic said Jews are often oppressors. Only 9% of people over 65, even that statistic is shocking, but compared to the youth, only 9% of people over 65 said that Jews are oppressors. So I think that anti-Semitism is rampant in the LGBTQ community, in the youth community of LGBTQ people, and it's also rampant in the general youth community.
So we'll come back to anti-Semitism, because I think that's a very important question, and I spoke with Corinne about that before we chatted, and I think her book makes a very interesting claim in that sense. I just want to come back to this question just of how representative are they, and because I was looking at all the demonstrations, but then I also went to the more institutionalized, right, kind of representatives, and I looked at Human Rights Campaign and Lambda Legal, Equality California, just whether the commentary section of The Advocate. I know maybe we would call these the mainstream representatives, and they were all unequivocally, condemning the Hamas massacre, in the strongest of languages. So that I think is a very important indicator, right? That the younger representatives don't necessarily kind of represent all or even most maybe of the community. I think Corinne did.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And there's, again, some interesting statistics within statistics about that. First of all, there's a break between gays and lesbians who have achieved I don't know anyone who I'd want to be friends with who's not pro-gay and lesbian. I just don't. And the acceptance of gay people, again, has been very mainstreamed. And so it wouldn't be so surprising to hear back from statistics that gays and lesbians per se are much more pro-Israel than transgendered people, who are more on the margins and more tending to identify with the radical aspect of gay and lesbian or the LGBTQ umbrella. Also, I think that they're very anti-Semitic, the young folks in general, not all of them, and most of the ones who are, I would say that it's more a problem of young college students than anyone else, that this is where you're going to get this very anti-Israel thing. And there's a lot of pressure. You can go into college feeling, first of all, you come into college and you don't know anything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But there's a lot of social pressure from BDS professors, from social contagion, from feeling the appeal of black and white thinking, from not knowing anything about the Middle East, and all these things and there's a bandwagon effect. So you get on the bandwagon and it's a way to displace anger over homophobia. So you get on this bandwagon and you end up saying things that are against your best interests. And gays and lesbians have more of a tendency to say, Israel is a democracy in a bad neighborhood that is very pro-gay. Whereas transgender people tend to say, and I'm not trying to be real critical of transgender people, I'm just saying this is what the research is saying. I have a theory about why this is the case, but they're saying more that Israel is an oppressive country. From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And when you press them on what they mean by that, what they'd like to see happen, you don't get a lot of clarity of response. Some of them who know Judith Butler, for example, will say there should be a dissolution of Israel as a Jewish state, and for there to be a so-called Greater Palestine, where you would have Jews living cheek by jowl with Palestinians. It would be the numerical majority.
So I wanna. I'm getting a lot of messages here in the audience that people want to talk about anti-Semitism, and they want to make that distinction, right? Because Lillian mentioned it a few times. But actually, I think we need to. Can we look past it? Because there are arguments here, right? And I think Corinne, right? We mentioned this, that your whole book, right? There are arguments that are being made here that cannot be just, right, kind of brushed aside or reduced to anti-Semitism, right? That and your book is called Queering Anti-Zionism, right? And it's that important distinction. Can you maybe speak then to what then are the justifications that critics are making from the perspective of anti-Zionism that aren't necessarily anti-Semitism? And I think I respect the fact that a lot of people have criticism of Israel. I certainly have it. That I don't think they shouldn't be dubbed anti-Semites, right? Because there is a distinction.
Right. Well, it's one thing to be critical of Israel. I'm critical of Israel as well. Another thing to want Israel to end or to be dissolved. And that is what they want. They either wanted to incorporate it into Greater Palestine, or they actually want the Jewish people to move out of Israel and go back to, quote unquote, where they came from. I've heard that. Or to, in some cases, just go into a civil war and perhaps be killed and destroyed, which is very shocking to hear. And I've heard that a few times as well. And here's the problem with talking about anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism. These days, the two tend to bleed into one another. So I'll give you an example of something I saw down on the New Haven Historical Green, which is right next to Yale. There was a group of protesters from Yale who were pro-Palestinian, and they were carrying Palestinian flags. And they went over to the New Haven Green, and there was a public menorah there. And they went up to the menorah, they shimmied up the pole, and they inserted a Palestinian flag into the menorah. Now, that's a very interesting thing because it represents exactly where the intersection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And actually, one young woman objected to the young man who shimmied up that pole and said, "You can't do that. We'll look like we're anti-Semitic." But it already had been an anti-Semitic action. But to the very large extent to which these young people are talking about Jews as oppressors, that there's a conspiracy of Jewish people worldwide to oppress brown people and Palestinians as being of a lower caste, it's anti-Semitism, distinctly.
I want to talk then about the Jewish factor in another sense. When I think about kind of the development of especially the gay and lesbian rights movement in the late 20th century, right? The advocacy and the leadership roles of so many Jewish Americans is so central, right? And it's obviously Harvey Milk, right? But not just him. I'm thinking about Barney Frank, right, the first kind of openly gay a member of Congress, and Larry Kramer, right, from ACT UP in the 80s, right, and fighting kind of and AIDS advocacy, and Martha Shelley, and Ed Koch and Bill Abzug, right? I mean, so I mean, Jewish Americans are so central to the story, and also to gay and lesbian rights in America. Is it possible that maybe what we're seeing, right, and again, thinking historically in the last 20, 30 years, with the rise of alternative movements, alternative leaderships, generational, obviously, a new generation has replaced them. Might this be part of the story? Maybe the fact that just a lot of the Jewish leadership or the Zionist Jewish leadership has just maybe been replaced by, we mentioned Black Lives Matter and maybe new generation, multicultural, multi-ethnic of new activists and new leaders. Might that be part of the story, Lillian?
I think it is. Incidentally, of the leaders that you mentioned, you left out Frank Kameny, who was perhaps...
Right. That's the hero of your book, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the movement has always been open and encouraging of people of color. And I think what's happened is that Jews have sort of stepped aside and people of color have been very active in the movement. And the left has been very active in the movement that gets so much attention now. And I think that Jews are sort of disappearing from the scene. They're disappearing from the scene in many other ways as well. They represent a far fewer number of students at elite colleges nowadays. They are much less likely to take prominent roles in the media nowadays. But to get back to the anti-Semitism in the movement, I think anti-Zionism often bleeds into anti-Semitism. And I think that the example I gave of Lion Les at Columbia really points that up. That is, supposedly it was Zionists who were not to come to the Black Lesbian Film Festival, but behind it, as we saw from the emails by the president of Lion Les, was the feeling that Jews have always been oppressors of brown people. That is not just Zionist, but Jews in general. So I think that there's definitely a rise in the United States of anti-Semitism, and I think it's due perhaps primarily to anti-Zionism.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
I want to note that it's been my experience and my observation, talking to a large number of people, that Black people in this country are, as Isabel Wilkerson would say in her book, Cast: The Origins of Our Discontent, are of an inferior caste. That's how they're perceived by white America. And I think that Black people see themselves in the Palestinians, not in the Israelis, not in the Jewish people. And that has a long history of a very fraught relationship between Jewish and Black people in this country. And it was better during the civil rights movement, and then it got problematic again. And there's always been a strain of anti-Semitism in the Black community, particularly among young Black men and Latino men as well. And so I think when Black people look at the conflict, they see themselves in the Palestinians. They identify with the Palestinians just as an oppressed people of so-called color, which is obviously ridiculous because that totally erases Mizrahi and Beta Jews. But there you have it. Those are the representations that they believe. Angela Davis, who's an African-American lesbian critic, wrote a book called From Ferguson to Palestine, New Movement. And she was arguing there for the intersection of movements, that all struggles to overcome oppression were the same, no matter what instance you were talking about. So she said Palestine was very much like Ferguson, Missouri. And she elided any differences whatsoever. So part of this is really depending upon the belief, and I think it's easy to read because it's very transparent. There's an oppressor versus an oppressed, and all the complexities get erased.
Let me follow up on that, if I may. With the founding of Israel in 1948, Black groups such as the NAACP, the National group for the advancement of colored people were very pro-Israel because
Right.
they saw in Israel, they saw in the story of the Jews a story that they could identify with, an oppressed people who, through Israel, had finally achieved some kind of liberation. Starting in the late 1950s with Malcolm X, who identified as a Black Muslim, the attitudes began to turn in the Black community. And I think that anti-Semitism became rife, not throughout the Black community. There were certainly instances, even in the 60s, of people like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin
Right.
and Roy Wilkinson, who were very pro-Zionist and saw the Jewish struggle as being similar in some ways to the Black struggle. But I think the dialogue that has taken over, and partly because of the stance that many ethnic studies courses have taken in the United States. And ethnic studies it's a required course in many high schools throughout the United States, in many colleges, and it has totally left out the story of the Jews, and it's about people of color and the oppression that Israel foists on people of color in the Middle East, the Palestinians, and I think that leads directly to an explanation for why young people tend to be so anti-Zionist and even anti-Semitic along with that.
So I think just first, right, you mentioned Bayard Rustin, and of course the story of, we've done a lot of stuff at the center about the relationship of Jews and African Americans, and of course that relationship was very, very close up until 1967. Right, that's very, profound support among the vast majority of African Americans for Israel. Right, to the extent that was one of the reasons also that the Democratic Party in the 40s and 50s, certainly Truman, recognized Israel because it was such a leading issue among African Americans. And of course, Bayard Rustin, right, is such a remarkable figure. I'm writing a book, and Rustin plays a central figure there, right? Bayard Rustin, not only an African American civil rights activist, but and a gay rights activist, at least in his final years in the 1980s, right? Bayard Rustin is an immensely Zionist. He is more Zionist than I would say most Israelis today, even, right? I spent a lot of time in his archives, and Bayard Rustin is an example, I think, of maybe of a fleeting type of kind of African American voter who is, he's very left-wing, he's very pro-Democratic Party, pro-labor, very progressive, but also still finds the ability to criticize Israel when it does bad things. And it obviously does bad things, like in the Lebanon invasion in 1982, which he criticizes, but, he doesn't kind of, throw the baby out with the bathwater. He still sees it as this emblem, as this bastion of democracy, a flawed democracy nonetheless, right? But a democracy. So just Bayard Rustin, I think, for our conversation is such an important figure because he shows you all the contradictions and all the paradoxes that maybe today a lot of LGBTQ, certainly African American ones, aren't really able to sustain. So we have a lot of questions from the audience. So I want to get some of these things out there. All right, so let me, because we have about 15 minutes, so I want to start. All right, so this is a few people, who are really who are mentioning the Israeli aspects, which we kind of mentioned, but I suppose I will play devil's advocate of sort, and I'll condense a few of these questions together. But this, I suppose the question then is, what role or responsibility do you think that Israel has, if any, to contributing to the emergence of this growing animosity, specifically among LGBTQ members in the United States, right? So and again, I don't think it it doesn't replace, I think, in any way all the stuff that was said until now. But the question, and it's a fair question, right? How has Israel contributed to this? And there's a few examples, and I'll just mention them, right? The first is, of course, just the ongoing occupation, the fact that in the last decade you've had a string of very right-wing nationalist governments. Of course, this last one under Netanyahu with Ben Gvir and is obviously the most nationalist right-wing and frightening, in my opinion, government Israel's ever had. I'm embarrassed and I'm terrified by it. A second thing is the Brand Israel campaign, right? We didn't mention this, but one of the reasons that the whole pinkwashing discourse gains momentum in the early 2000s is because it's a reaction to some extent by an attempt by Israel's foreign ministry to brand Israel, right? By using kind of Israel as this gay, Tel Aviv as this gay paradise and the Pride Parade and so forth, to kind of pinkwash the Palestinian civil rights issue, and that's it maybe. So I'll leave it with that. What role does Israel then do you think has in this story?
Well, let me address the Brand Israel campaign for one thing. It seems to me that Brand Israel, and for people in the audience who aren't familiar with that, it was Sarah Schulman who exposed the fact that for 3 years, Israel had been working with an American company to find ways to present Israel as being more modern, and certainly being pro-LGBT was more modern. Schulman's point was that was to cover up the fact that Israel was militaristic and oppressive of people of color, namely Palestinians. But it seems to me that all governments do that. I don't know about commercials in Israel, but I'm so amused by commercials in the States of travel to whatever country, because we're so whatever. It's part of tourism. Of course, Israel would have an investment in attracting people to the country as tourists. It looks at Israel, that is Schulman's criticism and Judith Butler's criticism, looks at Israel as conniving and dishonest, and discounts the fact that there's been a LGBT movement in Israel that's fought for rights, and they've received their rights way before Americans received rights. Sodomy laws, for instance, were repealed in Israel 15 years before they were repealed in America. Non-discrimination laws were passed many years before they were passed in America. Gay and lesbian people had the right to, and transgender people as well, had the right to serve in the military in Israel years before they were given that right in America. But the propaganda has been that Israel does all of this simply to take away from the fact that it's militaristic and chauvinistic even, and is dishonest and conniving in its support of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
Let me follow up on that issue, and I want to explore just a little bit in relation, going all the way back here to the satirical clip we started with, and say that one of the things that young gays and lesbians, LGBTQ people do to support their claims about preferring the Palestinian cause is to, and particularly with this whole problem, well, how can you support the Palestinian cause? Look at how homophobic Palestinians, particularly people in Gaza or Hamas, truly are. And what they will do is they will talk about groups in the occupied territories, Al-Quds, Aswat, and Isha Isha, that I've visited them in the West Bank, and here's what they say, that look, we are members of a traditional society, and our sexuality is not going to be the same as Western sexuality. We're not interested in Western forms of liberation. We live within a traditional society, and we're going to cope or live with that. And of course, on a practical level, that means that they're in the closet. And, you know, so there's real limitations to what they're proposing, and a lot of it is propelled, of course, this is from a Palestinian point of view, by anti-Israelism. That would be par for the course. But there are arguments, and young gay people in the United States are picking up on them, that it's not just a black hole of homophobia. There are Palestinian queer groups.
Right.
And
Right,
they make common cause with them and try to support them. If you look like somebody like Rashida Tlaib, who's a United States Palestinian American representative, and her office has a flag of Palestine, a flag of the United States, and a LGBTQ flag. So she's trying to merge them, and she's actually been effective in sort of getting the pressure off of gay LGBTQ groups in Ramallah, for example, or other places in the occupied territories.
Right. So I'm getting here just a lot of messages. I do want to clarify. Then one is right. So I think one of the things that a lot are saying is really right. The fact that one of the arguments that are voiced among LGBTQ Palestinians, right, it's that there's this priority that first, right, they need to secure first just their human rights as Palestinians, right, and only then they could kind of cultivate or develop or realize kind of their sexual orientation as LGBTQ, right. So for many, and this is also some colleagues of mine, some friends of mine, they, you know, that's why they kind of don't accept the Israeli claim that, right, that Israel is a kind of a gay paradise or something, because they say, well, no, you know, you have to first respect my human rights as a Palestinian, and only then I could kind of redeem my rights as gay or lesbian or so forth. Another reminder, and it's an important thing also, that in Israel we also have a long way to go, right? In that sense, you know, Lillian mentioned gay marriage, which in America is the law of the land, and it's been that way for over a decade, really. And right, and Israel is with all of the progress, and it obviously, in comparison to the Middle East and the Arab world, it is remarkable, and it's by Western standards in terms of LGBTQ rights, but not marriage, right? That's kind of light years away here because of the religion.
But marriage performed in other places is recognized.
Is recognized. That's true, right? Right.
And
that's because of the court.
I understand now even an online marriage would be possible and it would be recognized in Israel.
And that's one of the
for heterosexuals who want to get married outside of Orthodoxy, they too have to travel.
Right.
Or go online. So I mean, it's the stranglehold the Orthodoxy has, Orthodox Judaism has on marriage.
Right. All right. So let's take two final questions. So one is maybe to try, obviously it's to speculate, but the question then is what is to be done in that sense, right? Can you think of a way to, you know, is there a way to maybe, I don't know, a remedy in terms of education, of better information, of dialogue, and dialogue's a difficult thing. And here I started our conversation today by qualifying the fact that we don't really have anyone here who, you know, obviously, naturally, who supports BDS because they support BDS, that they don't want to engage in dialogue with us. But what can be done in that sense? Because if you look at the demographics in the United States, and we've been looking at it a lot in Israel, right? Americans are getting younger. They're obviously getting much more critical of Israel, much more sympathetic to the Palestinians. And that's certainly trickling down also into the LGBTQ community. So is this something that's deterministic because of demography? Or do you think there's certain things that can actually, change this? And I'll just say one thing that's important. I put in the message in the chat for everyone on the chat. I know on YouTube you can't see that, but you can see it if you're on the Zoom. A few books that offer the kind of the alternative perspective. We mentioned Sarah Schulman a lot here, and I thought it's fair to give her at least, to give a reference to her book, which is an interesting book, even if I disagree with it. I think it's an interesting read. And also Saeed Achan's book, Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique. I think these are books that people interested in our discussion should read, kind of, and think about, because they offer the perspectives we weren't able to. Sorry. So yes, please, Lillian. Yeah.
You ask what could be done.
Yeah.
I have really despaired in recent years that the Jewish story isn't being told in high schools and in colleges. In many places, students have to take ethnic studies courses. They learn about intersectionality. They learn about decolonization. They learn that Israel is a villain. They learn nothing about the Jewish story. They learn nothing about the Holocaust, for instance. They learn nothing about why Israel was founded in 1948. They learn nothing about the struggles that Israel has had in various wars. They learn nothing even about the American Jewish story. And so my hope that ethnic studies courses will include materials that it's been avoiding for the last 10 years or so. But I want to say, too, that, looking at those polls that I mentioned earlier, the prevalence of anti-Zionism and even anti-Semitism in the younger generation, and how in the older generation it almost doesn't exist. Something like 9 or 10% of people over 65 express anti-Semitic views. The people who were part of the student revolts in 1968, for instance, they certainly would have expressed pro-Palestinian views if they had been asked. They're the ones who were in the over 65 category. And so I think attitudes change perhaps as people get older. And so there's some hope that would happen. But mostly I think that what needs to be done is that ethnic studies courses need to be more integrated than they have been over the last 10 or 15 years.
So that means, but that also means that the primarily you find the source of the problem in academia, in the way that.
Yes. If I could mention something briefly, anti-Semitism in colleges has recently become so bad, and we all know, because there was 1 billion viewers, how those 3 university
the hearings,
poll for anti-Semitism may in fact inspire some change, because part of it is coming from Black students, but also a great deal is coming from Muslim students, the anti-Semitism, and it's being sort of proliferated from there because that's what they learn in their home countries. There is some hope for some reform just based upon the severity of the problem on college campuses. But I'd also like to agree with Lillian that it's not going to change until how the story of ethnicity is taught, and also how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is taught. There are professors who are regularly violating the norms of academic freedom in how they teach these classes in a wholly one-sided way. And of course, part of academic freedom is a free and fair exchange of ideas across differences to produce new knowledge. And this is what the BDS people refuse to do. So their writings tend to be, as I outline in my book, very narrow-minded, very narrow, very propagandistic, and very self-referential.
So a few people asked just questions I didn't have time to raise about trends, and I think we more or less kind of answered that, in the sense that that this it's not necessarily a trend, something fleeting, right? That you go to college and then you get swept up in the demonstrations, and that's part of the romanticism of being in college. I don't think that's what we're saying, right? Because they are acquiring certain ideas and critical theories and ideologies that they will be taking with them, right, once they leave college.
Maybe not.
Okay.
Adulthood does interesting things to people. It grows them up. A lot of this is just, this kind of rebellion and throwing in people's faces and being young. And it's fairly mindless.
Right. So just one final question, because we're almost out of time, and maybe then it'll be a personal question in the sense of how have each of you encountered, if at all, this anti I don't know if it's anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism or just the hostility or criticism of Israel in your own kind of careers, because both as scholars but also Jewish women, right, and lesbians. So and it kind of it kind of brings together, I think, our discussion today. Just maybe if you have a personal experience maybe that you want to share in that sense.
I think I first became aware of the extent of anti-Zionism in academia in 2012. I attended the Modern Language Association, which is the big professional organization of people in modern languages. And there was a session that about 200 women came to that celebrated the 30th anniversary of a wonderful book that came out in 1982 called Nice Jewish Girls, which was an anthology, a collection of essays by Jewish lesbians. And I thought that this is going to be a terrific session. They're going to talk about the progress we've made in 30 years and what it means to be Jewish and to be a lesbian and to celebrate the 30-year anniversary. And immediately it was clear that this was going to be an anti-Zionist discussion. There were 200 people there, and there was very little opposition to the anti-Zionism of everyone in the room who came to celebrate Nice Jewish Girls and who instead talked about the evils of Israel. It affected me profoundly and led to several articles that I then wrote about the growth of anti-Zionism in the LGBTQ community.
Corinne? And
yes,
I know you mentioned this in your book as well.
Right. In my book, I mentioned that the whole book was sort of inspired by a hate crimes serial that occurred to me during Operation Hot Winter in March 2009. And my office was defaced and also the door slashed. And there were death threats left on my voicemail. And what was interesting was the hate was anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and homophobic. And it was the only thing that was acknowledged by the newspapers, by the people who came by, the police officers, everyone, was the homophobia. The anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism fell off the side of the planet. And it was then I sort of woke up and realized there was a real problem going on in university campuses, and that it was much more the closet for being in the closet as a Zionist and a Jew was a lot larger than being in the closet as a gay person on American university campuses. So that was inspired the book.
So on that note, I wish we could have something more uplifting, but it is a great book. So I'm happy at the very least that it motivated you and spurred you into writing the book. So I want to thank both our panelists, Lillian and Corinne. I certainly want to urge our audiences to read their books. In addition, I wrote on the chat a few other alternative books. If anyone wants a reading list, of a variety of perspectives and research or scholarship, then feel free to email me, email the center, and we'll share that. And then again, thank you for your time, both of you. We learned a lot. Thank you to our audiences in Israel, around the world. And please follow us on Facebook, YouTube. All our events are up on YouTube, and have if you're in Israel, have a good evening, and if you're in the United States, then have a wonderful day and a happy New Year as well.
Thank you very much.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Stay safe.
Good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.